Emma Castellan stood at attention in the grand hallway of the Imperial Dragon Palace, her brand new ceremonial helmet sitting perfectly straight on her head. The polished silver surface reflected the crystalline walls that surrounded her, walls that seemed to pulse with an inner light she didn't quite understand. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to remember every rule from her training manual. Don't make eye contact with dragons unless addressed. Keep your posture rigid. Never, under any circumstances, touch a dragon without permission. The list went on, each rule more terrifying than the last. You look like you're going to faint, whispered the guard beside her, a veteran named Thomas Reed who had served at the palace for 5 years. Breathe, Castellan. The Emperor's hatching ceremony is supposed to be beautiful, not deadly. Emma tried to smile, but her face felt frozen. She had dreamed of serving in the Imperial Guard since childhood, inspired by stories of the ancient alliance between dragons and humans. But standing here, surrounded by creatures who could incinerate her with a single breath, those dreams felt naive. The ceremony chamber doors opened with a sound like thunder, and Emma's breath caught at her throat. Emperor Scarathus dominated the vast chamber, his scales the color of midnight storms, swirling with flecks of silver that seemed to contain entire galaxies. He was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Beside him sat the enormous egg that had been the talk of both dragon and human kingdoms for months. The Emperor's first offspring in 3 centuries. Emma watched in awe as the egg began to crack, each fracture spreading like lightning across its surface. The assembled dragons hummed in a frequency that vibrated through her bones, a song of welcome she could feel but not quite hear. Human dignitaries stood in their designated area, equally mesmerized. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the egg shattered. The hatchling that emerged was smaller than Emma expected, roughly the size of a large horse. His scales were deep amber with swirls of gold, and his eyes opened to reveal irises that shifted between green and bronze. Prince Raventhorn, as he would be named, looked around the chamber with unmistakable intelligence. And then those shifting eyes locked directly onto Emma. "Why is he staring at you?" Thomas muttered from the corner of his mouth. Emma didn't dare respond. She kept her gaze forward, trying not to panic as the hatchling took an unsteady step toward the human section. Emperor Scarathus made a low rumbling sound, and every dragon in the room went still. "The young one shows interest in our human allies," the Emperor said, his voice resonating through the chamber. "This is unusual, but not unwelcome." Prince Raventhorn wobbled across the polished floor, his talons clicking with each step. He passed the ambassador of the Northern Kingdoms. He ignored the High Chancellor of the Western Territories. He walked directly to Emma and sat down, tilting his head as he studied her helmet. The chamber fell absolutely silent. "Guard," Emperor Scarathus addressed her directly, and Emma nearly fainted from the honor and terror of it. "What is your name?" "Emma Castellan, Your Imperial Majesty," she managed, her voice somehow steady despite her shaking knees. "My son appears fascinated by your helmet, Emma Castellan. Would you permit him to examine it?" Every rule in Emma's training manual screamed at her to refuse, to maintain protocol. But she looked down at the hatchling, at the innocent curiosity in those color-shifting eyes, and found herself carefully removing her helmet. Prince Raventhorn made a sound of pure delight, like chiming bells. He reached out one small claw and gently tapped the silver surface, watching it ring. Then he did something that made every dragon in the room inhale sharply. He picked up the helmet in his jaws, incredibly gently, and placed it on his own head. An ancient dragon near the Emperor, one whose scales had faded to pale gray with age, suddenly spoke. "The choosing has begun." "Sage Meridian," the Emperor acknowledged. "Explain." The old dragon's voice trembled with something that might have been excitement or fear. "There's a prophecy, ancient even by our standards. When a dragon prince chooses a human artifact as his first treasure, it signals a bond that will reshape both species. I never thought to witness it." Emma stood frozen as dozens of dragon eyes focused on her. Captain Helena Frost, her commanding officer, looked like she might have a heart attack. But Prince Raventhorn seemed oblivious to the tension, happily wearing Emma's helmet while making soft chirping sounds. "This is highly irregular," Captain Frost said carefully. "With respect, Your Majesty, Guard Castellan is very new to her post. Perhaps a more experienced human would be better suited for whatever this situation requires." Emperor Scorathus lowered his massive head to study Emma. She felt like a mouse being examined by an eagle, except this eagle could read her thoughts if he wished. "The young do not choose based on experience, Captain," the Emperor said. "They choose based on something deeper, some quality they need but cannot name." He paused. "Guard Castellan, would you be willing to remain near my son during his crucial first days? It would be temporary, until we understand this unprecedented situation." Emma looked at the hatchling, who had gotten the helmet stuck on his head and was now stumbling around in circles, making indignant noises. Despite her terror, she felt a smile tugging at her lips. "I would be honored, Your Majesty." Hours later, Emma found herself in a chamber she never imagined entering, the royal nursery. Prince Raventhorn had refused to release her helmet, and when anyone tried to take it, he would wrap himself protectively around it and hiss. The only compromise was allowing Emma to stay. "I cannot believe this is happening," Captain Frost said, pacing outside the nursery. "You're the youngest guard in the palace. You've been here 3 days. 3 days, Castellan." "I know, Captain. And now you're sleeping in the prince's nursery because he's attached to your helmet." "I know, Captain." Helena Frost stopped pacing and looked at Emma, really looked at her. "Are you terrified?" "Absolutely," Emma admitted. "Good. That means you're smart." The captain's expression softened slightly. "But I saw how you smiled at him when he got stuck. That was genuine." Dragons value genuine emotion above all else. Inside the nursery, Prince Raventhorn had finally removed the helmet and was curling up to sleep, but he kept one small claw touching the silver surface. Sage Meridian appeared in the doorway, moving silently despite his size. "The young prince will need teaching," the old dragon said softly. "Not just dragon ways, but understanding of humans. You, Emma Castellan, will be his bridge between worlds." Emma looked at the sleeping hatchling, at the gentle rise and fall of his breathing, at the way his scales seemed to glow softly in the dim light. "I don't know how to teach a dragon prince," she whispered. "Then you will learn together," Sage Meridian replied. "As the prophecy intended. Your helmet was just the beginning, young guard. What comes next will require courage from you both." As Emma settled into a chair near the sleeping prince, watching her helmet gleam in the moonlight streaming through crystal windows, she wondered what she had gotten herself into. Prince Raventhorn stirred in his sleep, reaching out to touch the helmet again, and made a small, contented sound. Despite everything, Emma smiled. Perhaps some bonds were meant to defy all logic and protocol. Perhaps some friendships began in the most unexpected ways. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new rules to navigate, and new boundaries to understand. But tonight, a dragon prince slept peacefully beside a human guard's helmet, and somehow that felt like the start of something extraordinary. Emma woke to the sensation of something warm and scaly pressed against her leg. She opened her eyes to find Prince Raventhorn had abandoned his cushioned sleeping area and was now curled around her feet, still clutching her helmet like a stuffed toy. The early morning light filtering through the crystal windows made his amber scales shimmer like liquid gold. "This is going to be harder to explain than yesterday," she muttered to herself, as if sensing she was awake. Raventhorn's eyes opened, those fascinating color-shifting irises focusing on her with unmistakable joy. He chirped happily and pushed the helmet toward her with his snout, then looked at her expectantly. "You want me to put on?" Emma asked, reaching for the helmet. The moment her fingers touched it, Raventhorn made that bell-like sound of delight again. But when she moved to place it on her own head, he shook his head vigorously and nudged it back toward himself. "You want to wear it?" Emma realized, smiling despite herself. "All right, Your Highness." One fashion statement coming up. She carefully placed the helmet on his head, adjusting it so he could see through the opening. Raventhorn immediately began prancing around the nursery, clearly proud of his accessory. Emma couldn't help but laugh, a sound that brought Sage Meridian to the doorway. "The prince has already eaten, I presume?" the old dragon asked, amusement evident in his voice that Emma's smile faded. "Eaten? I thought someone else would handle that. Dragons feed their own young. But this one has no mother, and his father has duties that cannot wait. It falls to his chosen companion." Sage Meridian gestured toward a corner where several platters of raw meat had been arranged. "He must eat to grow strong." Emma approached Raventhorn with a piece of meat, trying not to think too hard about what kind of animal it came from. But when she offered it to him, the young prince turned his head away stubbornly. "Come on," Emma coaxed. "You need to eat." Raventhorn simply sat down and stared at her, making no move toward the food. For 2 hours, Emma tried everything. She held the meat closer. She tried different pieces. She even attempted making encouraging sounds like she'd heard the adult dragons make. Nothing worked. Raventhorn remained stubbornly seated, occasionally glancing at the helmet he'd had to remove to eat, then back at Emma. Captain Frost arrived to check on her, took one look at the situation, and sighed. "He hasn't eaten. He won't even try," Emma said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong." Sage Meridian entered again, watching the scene with ancient eyes. "You are doing nothing wrong, young guard. The prince is testing whether you will stay." "Stay? I haven't left. But you will have to, eventually," the old dragon explained. "Duty will call. Other humans will demand your time." He fears the abandonment that comes with attachment. His mother's absence at hatching has made him cautious. Emma looked at Raventhorn, who was now trying very hard to appear disinterested in both her and the food. Her heart ached at the thought of this small creature feeling abandoned at only 1 day old. She sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and placed the meat aside. Then she took off her guard jacket and folded it carefully. "What are you doing?" Captain Frost asked. "Making a promise," Emma said softly. She placed her jacket next to Raventhorn, along with her helmet. "These are mine, Your Highness. I'm leaving them with you. That means I have to come back for them. Do you understand? I will always come back." Raventhorn tilted his head, studying the items she'd left. Then, slowly, he reached out and pulled them closer, creating a small nest around himself. When Emma offered the meat again, he took it. The following week transformed Emma's entire existence. She moved into a chamber adjacent to the nursery, her few possessions looking sparse in the grand space. Every morning began with Raventhorn checking that her helmet and jacket were still where he'd left them, and every morning Emma had to earn his trust anew by being present. But gradually, something beautiful began to emerge from the routine. Emma discovered that Raventhorn loved stories. She would read to him from books she'd brought from the human quarters, tales of adventure and exploration. The young dragon would curl up beside her, his eyes wide as she described places he'd never seen. And sometimes, when she paused, he would make small sounds as if asking her to continue. "You understand more than anyone realizes, don't you?" Emma whispered one afternoon, and Raventhorn's eyes seemed to glow with agreement. She also learned that dragons played differently than she expected. Raventhorn loved puzzles and would spend hours arranging colored stones and patterns, chirping with satisfaction when he created something symmetrical. Emma began bringing him new challenges, wooden blocks that stacked, ribbons that could be woven, even simple musical instruments from the human quarters. One day, Captain Frost found Emma teaching Raventhorn a clapping game, their movements synchronized despite the vast difference in their hands and claws. "This is unprecedented," the captain said, but she was smiling. "The Emperor has asked me to inform you that your temporary assignment is now permanent. You are officially Prince Raventhorn's companion. It's a position that has never existed before." Emma felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Belmano, he trusts you, Castellan. More than that, he learns from you. Sage Meridian believes you're teaching him things no dragon could." 2 months after the hatching, the palace prepared for the Festival of Lights, an ancient celebration shared by both dragons and humans. Raventhorn had grown considerably, now the size of a small elephant, but he still insisted on wearing Emma's helmet whenever possible, even though it barely fit anymore. "You need your own helmet," Emma told him one evening, and his eyes dimmed with what she'd learned to recognize as sadness. Not instead of this one, she added quickly. In addition to it, this one is our promise helmet. The new one would be your festival helmet. Raventhorn perked up immediately, and Emma found herself sketching designs while he watched over her shoulder, occasionally tapping pieces he liked. Together, they created something unique, a helmet that blended dragon and human aesthetics, with curved horns to accommodate his growing size and etchings that told the story of their friendship. When the palace metalworkers presented the finished piece, Raventhorn's joy was unmistakable. But the festival brought unexpected challenges. During the grand celebration, as dragons and humans mingled in the enormous courtyard, Emma noticed a group of older dragons watching Raventhorn with disapproval. He was playing a human game she'd taught him, rolling a ball back and forth with some human children who'd been brave enough to approach. "This is unseemly," one of the dragons said, loudly enough for Emma to hear. His scales were deep crimson, and his eyes held ancient pride. A dragon prince, playing human games, wearing human trinkets. What has become of our heritage? Sage Meridian moved to intercept, but Raventhorn had already heard. The young prince stopped playing, his head lowering with uncertainty. Emma felt anger flare in her chest. "With respect," she said, stepping forward even though protocol dictated she remain silent. "Prince Raventhorn is learning to understand both worlds. Isn't that stronger than knowing only one?" The Crimson Dragon turned his gaze on her, and Emma felt the weight of centuries behind those eyes. "You are the human who corrupts him with your ways. I am the human who loves him," Emma said firmly, "and who teaches him that wisdom comes from understanding all perspectives, not just the ones we're born into." A hush fell over the nearby crowd. Dragons and humans alike stopped to watch the confrontation. Emma's heart raced, but she refused to back down. She felt a presence beside her and looked down to see Raventhorn standing at her side, wearing both helmets. The promise helmet balanced on top of his new festival helmet in a precarious but determined stack. Emperor Scarathus's voice cut through the tension. "Interesting words, Guard Castellan. Do you claim to know what is best for my son better than his own kind?" Emma swallowed hard, but met the Emperor's gaze. "No, Your Majesty. I claim only that I know what I see. I see a prince who is curious about everything, who learns faster than anyone expects, and who has the rare gift of seeing beauty in both dragon and human ways. I think that makes him stronger, not weaker." The Emperor studied her for a long moment, then turned to Raventhorn. "My son, you wear two helmets tonight." "What?" Raventhorn made a series of sounds, more complex than Emma had heard before. She realized with shock that he was trying to speak, forming words in the dragon language she'd been studying. Sage Meridian translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says, "One helmet is my promise that Emma will return. One helmet is my promise to learn both worlds. Together, they are my promise to be wise enough to unite them." Emperor Scarathus rose to his full height, his presence commanding absolute attention from every being in the courtyard. "It seems my son has already understood something that took me centuries to learn. Strength is not found in isolation, but in the courage to build bridges." He turned to the Crimson Dragon and the others who had objected. "You fear that human influence will weaken our heritage. But look at what it has already created. A prince who speaks earlier than any hatchling in recorded history. A prince who thinks in patterns both ancient and new. A prince who chooses compassion over pride." The Emperor's gaze swept across the assembled crowd. From this day forward, Emma Castellan is not merely a companion. She is recognized as Raventhorn's bridge builder, a title of honor in both our peoples. And this festival shall mark not just the lights that guide us, but the bonds that strengthen us. Emma felt tears pricking her eyes as Raventhorn pressed against her side, both helmets still wobbling on his head. The young dragon made his bell-like sound of happiness, and around the courtyard, first one human, then another, and finally even some of the dragons began to chime glasses and hum in harmony. Captain Frost appeared at Emma's side, her usually stern expression soft with pride. "You did well, bridge builder. though I may never forgive you for making me this emotional at a public event. As the festival continued, Emma watched Raventhorn return to playing with the human children, several young dragons now joining in. The game was transforming into something new, incorporating dragon wing movements and human clapping rhythms. Sage Meridian settled beside her, his ancient eyes reflecting the festival lights. The prophecy spoke of a bond that would reshape both species. I think, young Emma, we are beginning to see what that means. Not a conquest of one way by another, but a blending that creates something neither could achieve alone. Emma looked at her hand, at the small scar on her palm where she'd accidentally cut herself making Raventhorn's helmet. The young prince had been so concerned, bringing her healing leaves he'd seen used in the dragon medical wing. Two worlds, learning from each other through the simple act of caring. I never expected any of this, Emma admitted. I just wanted to be a good guard. You became something better, Sage Meridian said. You became a friend when one was needed most. Never underestimate the power of that choice. As the twin moons rose over the palace, casting silver light across scales and skin alike, Emma knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, watching a dragon prince play peacefully with humans while wearing two helmets as symbols of promises kept and futures embraced, she allowed herself to feel hope. The bridge between their worlds was being built, one moment of understanding at a time. And it had all started with a hatchling's choice to love a human's helmet. 3 years had passed since the Festival of Lights, and Prince Raventhorn had grown into a magnificent young dragon. His amber scales now held deep veins of gold that caught the light with every movement, and his wingspan could cast shadows across the entire palace courtyard. But despite his impressive size, he still kept Emma's original helmet in his private chambers, polished to perfection and resting on a velvet cushion. Emma had grown too, though not in physical stature. At 22, she had become one of the most respected voices in the palace, her role as bridge builder expanding far beyond anyone's initial expectations. She mediated disputes between dragons and humans, helped design new educational programs that taught both species about each other, and most importantly, remained Raventhorn's closest friend and advisor. But peace, Emma had learned, was always fragile. The trouble began on a crisp autumn morning when Ambassador Jade Winters arrived from the Human Coalition with troubling news. Emma was summoned to the Emperor's council chamber, where she found Raventhorn already waiting, his expression uncharacteristically serious. Bridge builder Castellan, Emperor Scarathus began, his voice heavy with concern. Ambassador Winters brings word of growing unrest in the outer territories. There are factions among both our peoples who believe our alliance has grown too close, too quickly. Jade Winters stepped forward, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too many political battles. To be blunt, there's a movement calling for the separation of our species. They claim that dragons and humans are too different to truly coexist, that this experiment in unity is doomed to fail. Emma felt her stomach drop. What kind of movement? How organized? Organized enough to be dangerous, Jade replied. They call themselves the Purists, and they exist on both sides. Dragon purists who believe human influence weakens dragon culture, and human purists who fear dragons will always see us as lesser beings. Raventhorn spoke for the first time, his voice now deep and resonant. This is my fault. If I had not bonded with Emma, if I had followed traditional paths, none of this would have happened. Don't you dare, Emma said sharply, then softened her tone. Your friendship didn't create hatred that already existed. It just forced people to confront their fears. Sage Meridian, now even more ancient and frail, spoke from his position near the window. The prophecy warned of this. The bond that reshapes must first survive the test of those who fear change. What comes next will determine whether our two peoples truly unite or fracture beyond repair. 2 weeks later, the crisis reached its peak. A delegation of purist dragons, led by the Crimson Dragon from the festival whose name was Thornscale, demanded an audience with the Emperor. They brought with them a formal challenge, one rooted in ancient dragon law that even Emperor Scarathus could not ignore. "We invoke the trial of heritage," Thornscale declared before the assembled court. "Prince Raventhorn must prove that his bond with humans has not corrupted his dragon nature. He must complete 3 traditional dragon trials without any human assistance. If he fails, the human Emma Castellan must be removed from the palace, and all bridge builder programs must be dissolved." Emma's blood ran cold. She looked at Raventhorn, who stood rigid with tension, his wings slightly extended in a defensive posture. "And if he succeeds?" Emperor Scarathus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Then we will accept that perhaps there is merit to this new way," Thornscale said, "though we reserve judgment on its ultimate value." The Emperor looked at his son. "Raventhorn, you are not obligated to accept this challenge. These trials were designed for dragons who have trained in isolation for decades. You have spent your years learning diplomacy and bridge building." Raventhorn met his father's gaze steadily. "If I refuse, it will be seen as proof that human influence has made me weak. The purists will use it to tear apart everything we've built." He turned to Emma, and she saw determination burning in his color-shifting eyes. "I accept the challenge." Emma wanted to protest, to argue that this was unfair and manipulative, but she knew Raventhorn was right. Sometimes the only way forward was through the fire. The first trial was the test of flame, held in the ancient volcanic chambers beneath the palace. A dragon had to produce fire hot enough to melt a specific type of crystal that could only be found in the deepest parts of dragon territory. Most dragons trained for years to generate the necessary heat. Emma stood with the other observers, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood. She couldn't help him, couldn't offer encouragement, couldn't even meet his eyes without violating the trial's rules. Raventhorn stood before the crystal, and Emma could see him trembling slightly. He had practiced fire breathing, of course, but never with this intensity, this pressure. The purest dragons watched with barely concealed satisfaction, certain he would fail. Then Emma saw something that made her heart swell with pride. Raventhorn closed his eyes and took a deep breath, and she recognized the technique immediately. It was a meditation exercise she'd taught him years ago, a human method for focusing under stress. He was using what she'd given him, not abandoning it. When Raventhorn exhaled, the flame that emerged was unlike anything Emma had ever seen. It burned with both the ancient fury of dragon fire and something else, something that seemed to dance with different colors and patterns. The crystal didn't just melt. It transformed, creating a sculpture of breathtaking beauty that depicted a dragon and a human standing side by side. The chamber fell silent. Even Thornscale looked shaken. Sage Meridian's voice trembled with awe. He has not lost his dragon nature. He has expanded it. The second trial took place 3 days later in the Storm Peaks, where unpredictable wind currents had claimed the lives of countless young dragons throughout history. Raventhorn had to navigate through the peaks and retrieve a specific flower that grew only on the highest, most dangerous cliff face. Emma watched from the observation platform, her heart in her throat, as Raventhorn launched himself into the violent winds. She saw him struggle, saw him get thrown off course multiple times, and had to fight the urge to cry out. But then she noticed something. Raventhorn wasn't fighting the wind the way traditional dragons did, using brute force to power through. Instead, he was reading the patterns, adapting his flight path in real time, using techniques that reminded her of the games they used to play with ribbons and air currents in the nursery. He was applying human problem-solving to dragon challenges, and it was working. When Raventhorn returned with the storm flower clutched gently in his claws, landing with a grace that belied the difficulty of what he'd just accomplished. Emma saw several of the purest dragons, exchanging uncertain glances. Captain Helena Frost, standing beside Emma, whispered, "He's not proving he's purely dragon. He's proving that being both makes him stronger." The third and final trial was the most difficult of all, the test of wisdom. Raventhorn had to enter the Chamber of Echoes, a place where dragon ancestors' memories were stored in crystalline formations. There, he would face a scenario from dragon history and have to make a choice that would reveal his true nature in '01 except Raventhorn would know what he experienced inside. The trial was deeply personal, meant to expose the core of who a dragon truly was. Emma waited outside the chamber for 6 agonizing hours. Jade Winters had arrived with more news of purest activity, reporting that this trial's outcome would likely determine whether the entire alliance held or shattered. The political pressure was immense. When the chamber doors finally opened, Raventhorn emerged looking exhausted but peaceful. He walked directly to where Emma stood, ignoring protocol, ignoring the gasps from traditionalists, and placed his massive head against her shoulder in the gesture of trust they'd shared since his hatching. "What did you see?" Emperor Scarathus asked gently. Raventhorn raised his head, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "I saw the moment when dragons chose to isolate themselves from other species, believing their power meant they needed no one else. I saw the centuries of loneliness that followed, the slow decline of our numbers, the gradual loss of wonder in our lives." He paused, looking around at all the assembled dragons and humans. "The ancestors asked me to choose. Would I follow the old path of isolation and traditional power, or would I forge a new path of connection and shared strength? They warned me that the new path would be difficult, that I would face opposition, that I would have to be brave in ways dragons have never been before." "And what did you choose?" Thornscale demanded. "I chose Emma," Raventhorn said simply. "I chose friendship over fear. I chose growth over stagnation. I chose to believe that being strong enough to be vulnerable, to learn from others, to admit we don't have all the answers, is the truest form of dragon wisdom." Sage Meridian moved forward, his ancient body trembling with emotion. "The ancestors showed you that vision because they wanted you to understand what they could not. They were not testing whether you would abandon human ways. They were testing whether you had the courage to unite what they had separated." He turned to address everyone present. The prophecy did not speak of a bond that would force dragons to become human or humans to become dragons. It spoke of a bond that would remind both species that isolation is not strength, that wisdom comes from many sources, that the future belongs to those brave enough to build bridges instead of walls. Thornscale stepped forward, and Emma tensed, expecting another challenge. But the Crimson Dragon lowered his head in a gesture of respect. "I have lived for 800 years, believing that tradition was the only path to preserving our heritage. But I see now that tradition without growth is not preservation, is stagnation." He looked at Raventhorn with something like wonder. "You passed the trials not by abandoning what Emma taught you, but by integrating it with dragon wisdom. You showed us that we can honor our past while embracing our future." Other purist dragons began to step forward, one by one, acknowledging what they had witnessed. The human purists in attendance looked less certain, but Jade Winters addressed them directly. "We humans have always feared what we don't understand," she said. "But Emma Castellan showed us something vital 3 years ago when she chose to stay with a dragon hatchling who needed her. She showed us that love and friendship can exist across any divide if we're brave enough to take the first step." That evening, Emperor Scarathus announced the creation of the Unity Accords, a formal agreement that would establish exchange programs, shared educational initiatives, and cultural celebrations between dragons and humans. The Bridge Builder program would expand, with Emma training others to serve in similar roles across all territories. But for Emma and Raventhorn, the most meaningful moment came later in the quiet of the palace gardens. "I was terrified you would fail," Emma admitted, sitting on a bench while Raventhorn curled around her protectively. "Not because I thought you weren't capable, but because the trials seemed designed to force you to choose between your dragon heritage and our friendship." They were, Raventhorn agreed. "But what Thornscale and the others didn't understand is that you are part of my heritage now. The moment I chose your helmet as my first treasure, I began writing a new chapter in dragon history, one where we don't have to choose between strength and connection." Emma reached up to touch one of his golden scales. "Do you remember that first night, when you wouldn't eat until I promised to come back?" "I remember being terrified of being alone," Raventhorn said softly. "I remember thinking that if I let myself care about you, You might disappear like my mother did. And then you gave me your helmet and your jacket, and you made a promise I didn't know humans could keep. I'll always come back, Emma whispered, the words as true now as they had been 3 years ago. I know, Raven Thorn said, and his eyes glowed with warmth. That's why I could face the trials. Because no matter what the ancestors showed me, no matter what challenges arose, I knew you would be waiting when I emerged. That kind of certainty makes every other fear seem small. Captain Frost found them there an hour later, dragon and human resting peacefully in the moonlight. She didn't interrupt, just smiled and turned away. Sage Meridian watched from a distant window, his ancient heart full. The prophecy is fulfilled, he murmured to Emperor Scarathus, who had joined him. Not in conquest or submission, but in the simplest and most profound way possible. Through friendship that refused to break, even under the weight of centuries of fear. My son chose well, the Emperor said, pride evident in his voice. When he picked up that helmet, he set in motion changes that will echo through generations. As did Emma when she chose to stay. Sage Meridian added, never underestimate the power of one person who refuses to let fear dictate their actions. Emma stood at the dedication ceremony for the Academy of Shared Wisdom, the first school where dragon and human children would learn together from hatchling stage through adulthood. Raven Thorn stood beside her, now fully grown and magnificent, serving as one of the Academy's founding instructors. In her hands, she held the original helmet, now a treasured artifact that would be displayed in the Academy's entrance hall. Its silver surface was worn from years of a young dragon, carrying it everywhere, but still gleamed in the sunlight. Do you ever regret it? Jade Winters asked, now a close friend and the Academy's human director. You gave up a normal life for this. Emma looked at Raven Thorn, at the students already arriving, a mixed group of young dragons and excited human children. She thought about the bridges they'd built, the minds they'd changed, the future they'd created together. I gave up a small life for an extraordinary one, Emma said. I got to watch a dragon prince grow up. I got to help change the world. And most importantly, I got to keep a promise to a scared hatchling who just needed someone to stay. Raventhorn lowered his head so she could scratch behind his ear ridge, a gesture of affection they'd never outgrown. And I got the greatest treasure any dragon could ask for, he added. A friend who saw past the scales and the fire to the person underneath. As the ceremony began, Emma placed the helmet in its display case, where it would inspire generations of students to come. Above it, an inscription read, every bridge begins with a single choice. Choose connection over fear. Choose friendship over isolation. Choose love over tradition. And watch the world transform. The helmet gleamed in its case, a simple piece of silver that had once belonged to a nervous young guard. But it had become so much more. A symbol of promises kept, fears overcome, and a future built on the revolutionary idea that understanding could triumph over prejudice. Emma looked out at the crowd of dragons and humans celebrating together, at the children who would grow up never knowing a world where their species were separate, and she smiled. It had all started because a hatchling chose a helmet. And everything that followed proved that sometimes the smallest choices create the greatest changes.